everyone, it's Kimberly, Study Abroad Specialist. In today's video, I want to talk about how government policies around the world can impact your study abroad journey. Welcome to the channel, everyone. If you are new here, again, my name is Kimber. I'm here to make your study abroad journey easier. And if you're returning, welcome back. So excited to dive into this video today. So I wanted to do this video to talk about government policies. It's not going to be any specific government because a lot of them function in a lot of the same ways. But I wanted to talk about the way that government policies can shape study abroad specifically, because whether it is student visas or funding for programs or the overall sort of arching political climate that you may be going into as a study abroad student, all the things that matter within a country that you're going to will eventually impact you as a study abroad student. And so I want to dive into that today. And there are 6 common areas that government policy can impact that we're going to talk about. But before I do that, if you look on the screen, I actually want to cover what government policy is, because you probably hear this term all the time of government policy, and it sounds very generic. And what does it mean? So in the context of what we're talking about today, government policy is the framework that controls mobility and the ability to access different areas of life. And for study abroad students, it's going to be visas, funding, safety, vaccines, anything you name it, healthcare, that is going to be included that you may need as a study abroad student. So I wanted to be able to get that out of the way first, just so that we both kind of agree on here what we're actually talking about, that this is the overall government policy. You also want to keep in mind too that, I mean, if you're going to a what I would consider free country, that, you know, where people have been duly elected, that it doesn't necessarily even matter who is in office at any time, any political party, that things shift and change for students in different ways, and that you just need to be aware of the political climate within whatever country that you're going to. And also to being aware of how your government interacts with the host country that you're going to. So as you know, there are some governments that are considered ally countries. So your government, no matter where you are coming from, probably has a few countries that are going to be ally countries, and then you have countries that are going to be more hostile. And even as you're going as a student, you're not going to be a hostile person to the people there, and they're probably going to welcome you. But just keeping in mind that those government policies may impact if you have a situation where you're going into hostile territory against your particular government. So I'm going to dive into the first area that can be impacted, which is very timely right now, and that's going to be student visas. So if you haven't had a chance to watch my recent video where I talked about some of the emerging countries that are becoming very popular for study abroad, definitely check that out. I'm going to link it above. But I talked about in that particular video the reason why the big 4, so United States, UK, Canada, and Australia, were sort of leveling off or even losing students for study abroad. And in that video, I mentioned that student visas is one of them. And this includes restrictions on student visas, the amount of student visas being given out every year, sort of the different hoops that you have to jump through to get a student visa, and why a lot of students don't want to put up with that anymore. And also, too, the fact that it can be really hard to obtain a post-student visa and be able to work in the country afterwards. But when it comes to student visas, this is one of the key areas that government policy can impact any type of student. So in 2025, we saw that, for example, with the new Trump administration, how that worked out and how it played out. A lot of those visas now have been restored. But we did see how when the administration took over, they immediately went over a lot of the visa policies from the past that had been in place for many, many years. Although these policies have been contested for many years, so it's nothing new, but actually going after schools like Harvard for issuing a lot of visas to international students and how that worked out. Similarly, in places like the UK, especially at the start of when Brexit got issued in, and it's continued on, of how the student visas are being issued. You see now in places like Australia, there's often a limit on the amount of permits that they're going to give out. And so it creates a very hostile situation. And there are 2 conversations to be had here. So you're not going to find me and any documentation on me that doesn't believe that I'm against strong immigration policy. I have been on this since probably a little child. It's something that I feel very passionate about, that, you know, you need to come in the country the right way and do the right thing and all the things. And on this channel specifically, I talk about not overstaying your visa, making sure that you're following all the rules, but also too, sort of factoring in that you're sort of weighing the fact of you are pushing people out and turning people away when you're doing that. And just giving it grace too, that I know for international students, especially here in the United States, but in other Western countries too, like Canada, like the UK, like a lot of you are often paying full freight, you're paying the full weight. And so I like to also honor that I know that you're very ambitious and you want to be here. And that's something that's also important too. And unfortunately, based on the way that government works and the politics of it all, that is not how it tends to shake out. It tends to be very political, and there's not sort of this thinking about, well, how do we weigh making sure that we obviously keep bad people out, but then also to weighing the fact that there are lots of ambitious students that want to be here, do the right thing, study, and eventually contribute to society. That is just not worked out. And with student visas, it gets caught up in that. And so being aware of the different rules, there's also too lots of other videos that I've done more recently on my channel about student visas. I'm going to link to a playlist for you that you can check out on that just to learn more about that. But this is an ongoing issue around the world. And just being aware of, I think it's very important for students to sort of understand, again, what the political climate is going into a country. So even if, let's say, you go through and you get a student visa, everything's great. What is going on in that particular country at that time that could put your student visa at risk? Also, too, what does it look like for you once you aren't a student? Are you able to stay on? Are you able to get another visa? This, again, is something that is turning a lot of students to more emerging countries so that they can move forward and they do have a welcoming place. But student visas are definitely one of the top areas that can impact you based on government policy. So the next area that government policy can impact when it comes to study abroad is going to be impacting how much money flows into a particular program, into a particular school. And in places like the US, this is very important, in Canada as well. For other countries where almost every school is, except for a few private ones, are run by the state, it's going to be even more important. But just sort of understanding that any type of government policy where, again, it may or not be tied necessarily strictly to immigration, but it could be tied to ideology. It could be tied to sort of maybe just thinking about maybe the program is more niche or whatever it is, that if it's a program that is dependent on government aid in any type of way, that this is something that can impact you. So for example, here in the US, you may have a program that is federally funded to a certain extent or state funded even. So that means that there's funding coming from a government body. And so they can often have oversight and regulations around what you can do. And with study abroad in particular, if it's a particular program that maybe is not performing as well and it needs a certain amount of funding, or if it's a study abroad program that is not as relevant as determined by whatever the governing body is, they can decide they want to cut that funding. Or if it's for more malicious reasons, they can decide to do that. So just being aware of the fact that it can impact you. Now, for a lot of private organizations that you may be working with, or if you're coming to study either here in the US or other places and you're going to, let's say, a K through 12 boarding school or something like that, they are, fully private. They're usually not having any type of government funding. But you just want to be aware of the fact that that is one of the areas that government policy can impact. We've seen this several times throughout the past 5 or 6 years where, for example, with COVID and how, in different countries they did it different ways, but how even if a school was considered private, that they still had to comply with whatever the vaccine policy was or whatever the actual mask policy was back when we were there. You've seen it more recently here in the US with different DEI policies and how that actually works. And so just keeping in mind that for the most part, most things outside of, again, K through 12 schools, and then there's some schools throughout other parts of the world that are like traditionally private. But in a lot of ways, most schools and colleges have to have some touch point with a government body for whatever reason, even if it's just to be just to make sure that they are in good standing and that they can operate. And so they can't necessarily do that outside of themselves. And so they need to make sure that they are following the rules. And a lot of times governments can impose those rules, particularly when it comes to the funding of a particular program or even a particular school. So just being aware of that. So for number 3, the third way that government policy can impact you as a study abroad student, this is going to be with health and safety. So, for example, we saw a lot of this throughout the pandemic of the way that a lot of students, if they want to be able to stay in a country, they were forced to get a vaccine. I know even in the very beginning of the pandemic, a lot of places you had to do that really awful up the nose, up the brain. I think it was the brain tickler COVID test that you had to do. Like that was actually pretty awful, but you had to do what you had to do to stay where you were. Just little policies like that, which are, they're not that little, but at that particular time, it's like little elements of whatever is happening when it comes to health policy. Vaccines are a big conversation right now, especially here in the US, and what that may look like as you're planning to come and study abroad, or will you need them to come study abroad? There's different policies around the world that can impact you for that. And some of the common ones we're seeing are obviously, as I mentioned, vaccines. So for a lot of countries, you are required to get more vaccines than you would need. Let's say if you're going to a place like South Africa or parts of the Middle East where it's required to get certain vaccines such as malaria or other types of vaccines that normally if you were in a Western country you may not need, and what that actually looks like for you. Are you able, again, are you able to have any protection against that if you get sick? You were just getting it for study abroad. What does that actually mean for you? This is something that students think about a lot. In terms of healthcare, this is something that students think about. Now, just keeping in mind that no matter where you are in the world, even here in the US, but also in other countries too, if you are experiencing a medical event and you need help, it is a requirement for most governments to be able to help you. So it doesn't matter in that particular moment if something has happened to you. Even in here in the US, you probably hear rumors about people asking for insurance. They will eventually get to that, like once you stabilize off. But that if you are having a medical event, like in the US, like the way that it works for study abroad students here is that usually you're covered under a policy under your school. But again, don't hesitate that just because you may be in a country that doesn't have free healthcare that you can't go and get help you need. If you have an emergency, you need to do that. And usually when you have orientation at whatever school you're going to, wherever you are in the world, even if it is a place that has free healthcare, because there's also a process for accessing that too in those countries, that's usually included in your orientation and how that actually works. But again, in terms of government policy, someone could decide tomorrow that suddenly any student who is studying abroad or from a non, let's say English speaking country or wherever doesn't have access to that. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but that it's elements like that that you may not be thinking of that can impact you. So again, being aware of what the safety policy and health policy is in the country that you're going in are going to be very important. In terms of overall safety, this is really a country to country issue. So it could be that you're thinking about safety from a terrorism aspect. So I think about the people who were both in Israel and Palestine on October 7th. There were lots of international students there in addition to everybody else, and what that looked like for them and how they had experienced that. Here, when we had 9/11 in the US, there were lots of international students here that were impacted. And so it's elements like that that you may also want to consider. Again, you can't necessarily predict that, but just being aware of that. If you are going to a country that has a lot of natural disasters, whether it be earthquakes or hurricanes or wildfires, again, this is something that if you are an international student, particularly, again, you rely heavily on your school to sort of help you figure out different things. But you also have to decide, like, is it going to be worth it for you to be able to stay? Are you going to need to evacuate? Your evacuation plan may look different from a student who normally lives here. And so you just need to be aware of what that actually looks like if you are going to be an international student doing it. Another element that is sort of the elephant in the room, if you will, as an American, I can speak to this. And this is something that, I've definitely looked at the data on this. I look at the data on this all the time. And so one of the trends that we're seeing is that there has been a drop over the past 20 years, more specifically the past 10 years, in students coming to study in the US. It's still a very popular place, especially for our top K through 12 schools, a lot of boarding schools, and then a lot of our marquee schools that like Yale, Harvard, all the ones that about, Stanford. But there has been an overall sort of shift and drop in what has been going on in terms of students wanting to come, that interest to come, in terms of weighing the cost benefit of what could potentially happen to them. And there's no way of getting around it, just kind of like mentioning it and just kind of saying that I'm aware, as most people are aware. But one of the things that I think that people don't always think about is that we think about it from the context of Americans and living here, but not how it actually always looks to other people and how it impacts the decisions that other people make. And one of the reasons that this is important is that, number one, international students, they do bring a lot to the country. A lot of times as an international student, you're likely paying full price to be here, and you want to work after you're here and do all the things that integrate into society. Like, we know that. But a lot of times the way that we're experiencing it is that we're thinking about it from ourselves as Americans, and not the fact that it also has an economic price on what happens in this country. And that is going to be the fact that a lot of students don't want to come here because they don't want to get shot in their classrooms. There's no other way to say that. There's no polite way to say that. And this is not any type of statement on the Second Amendment. There's no person probably more Second Amendment than me. I'm actually named after a firearm brand. And so it's true. I'm not new to this. I'm true to this, as a lot of the kids say. And so it's not about that. And again, there's not necessarily a simple solution to this. This is a conversation that we've had for eons and decades, whether you think that there should be gun control or there should be no guns at all or whatever it is. And again, it doesn't necessarily even depend on who's in the White House, who's doing this. No one has come up with a solution that has actually stuck and worked. But the problem is that in sacrifice of that, and again, I'm not going to dive into the deep politics of that. Everybody has their own opinion, and that's not what this channel is about. But it really is about saying that in the sacrifice of that, there is definitely, obviously, the human sacrifice of the human beings that have died, but also, too, the fact that there are other elements that impact this, including basically our foreign commerce, in the way of education, of students not wanting to come here. They want to be able to study abroad, but they don't want to die in the process of doing that. And that is something that also needs to be part of the conversation, that it's not just the people that live in this particular country that are impacted by that. And I just wanted to highlight the fact that I'm aware of that, especially, and hyper aware as someone that does this all the time and is looking at the trends, that I understand that that is one of the top sticking points that international students wrestle with when they're thinking about coming to the US. On the flip side of that, you look at how, for example, in the video I mentioned that New Zealand is actually growing in students. One of the key data points has showed that in addition to all of the elements that they offer in terms of education and the ability to work afterwards, is that it was really impressed upon students that the fact of how they reacted to that horrible tragedy a few years ago. And that's a comparison point between the US and how it works here. And so sort of the inaction is taking a lot of money out of this country to move it to other countries. And that's ultimately something that we're going to have to deal with, and that I guess we've decided that we're going to deal with in this country. And again, it's not just to talk about gun policy in America. There are other countries, obviously, that don't have necessarily the level of mass shootings, but also have other elements of safety to think about. But I always like to just kind of be honest and just highlight the fact that I understand what's going on, and knowing that health and safety is a broad spectrum. And so whether you're talking about gun safety or vaccines, or you're talking about the potential of an epidemic or a pandemic or hurricanes or wildfires, that there's all these things that students who are not from a country have to think about, and you have to think about it in a different totality, because you likely have a different sort of sensitivity to being safe and being aware of what's going on compared to people that live there. So I already touched on number 3, which is going to be political relationships, earlier, but I did just want to dive deeper into it to talk more about the importance of political relationships and how they work when it comes to you going to study abroad to a country, and how it can impact you as a student. The 2 primary ways that this is going to work against you is going to be through sanctions, and also going to be through tariffs. And tariffs have been really popular to talk about this year, but I also want to talk about sanctions as well, because depending on whatever country you are coming from, if you're going to a Western country, there have been periods of time where there have been sanctions on countries. And I can just talk a little bit about an example I have of when I had moved into doing my graduate degrees overseas, and this was in 2009, 2008, 2009, 2010. And so things around the world were not that great, very blessed and fortunate that I could move forward with what I was doing and, not really worry about the money. But there were a lot of people that were suffering around that time, and a lot of them weren't suffering because they were broke. They were suffering because their countries had sanctions against them. And I remember very clearly in one of my programs, there was some chitter chatter. Students were talking about, like, have you heard about the Saudi suitcase boys? And I'm like, no, I've not heard about, first of all, what is a Saudi suitcase boy? What is he doing here? And so, like, it was a nickname that people had given, I think on Twitter at the time, to, there was this group of men, I mean, they're men, like 19, 20, whatever, they're in graduate school or at least undergrad coming to the school. But it was from Saudi Arabia, from Russia, and from Iran as well. Like literally, like groups of maybe 9, 10, 15 boys, men, walking in with suitcases full of money, walking straight to the financial aid office to pay in whatever the currency was. So British pounds at where I was, but it had been happening in other countries too, like Italy and around Europe at that time. That's what they were talking about. And I'm like, no, I had not heard about this. And one of the reasons was because at the time, the US, the UK, and other countries had sanctions on Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And these students were trying to pay their tuition. You know, it's great that they could just pay it in full in cash. That's pretty sweet, but I had not really heard about it. And so I'm thinking like, oh, that's not really, you know, like whatever, like it's just probably a rumor or whatever it is. And at that time, again, it was just kind of Twitter and Facebook. Like no one was kind of sitting there on TikTok taking video until one day I was sitting in the lobby of my school and I saw it. Like there were literally probably about maybe 8 of them that got out of a car. They had a police escort. They had their suitcases and they were literally like escorted through to walk through financial aid to pay. I don't know if they're from Saudi Arabia or not, based on how they were dressed, but they were doing that and it was very real. And the reason why is because of sanctions. Things like that are real. To just kind of cover what a sanction is. So a sanction is essentially a prohibitor on the financial performance and financial ability for a country to perform. So this is not typically going to be on a direct person. Sometimes it can be, and sometimes that can impact it. Let's say if you come from a country that has a ruler that is over every single thing. But the way that it works is that a lot of countries in the West will sanction, they'll sanction oil, they'll sanction textiles, and it means that it impacts the way that the country can do business that's being sanctioned. And in this particular instance, coming from places like Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iran, it was based on oil. And so these kids have a lot of money. It's not about the money, but it's about having access to that money to be able to pay. And so something like that can really impact people, even if they have a lot of money to be able to make the payment. And so just being aware of that, you may not be walking through your school with a suitcase of, you know, 25,000 British pounds, but just being aware of the fact that things like that can impact you. As well, more recently, tariffs, that's something that is also going to be important to sort of think about in the way that maybe your country is interacting with another country that has tariffs and what that looks like even as a student coming to study abroad, how that's going to impact your currency and what that actually looks like. But I always like to tell that story because people are like, what does that even mean to see people walking through and you know that they have suitcases full of money and why would they be doing that? And I just like to explain that to sort of help you understand that it can really quickly kind of turn around. And again, it's not about them not having the money. It's about them having the access to the money and being able to do what they need to do so that they can go to school. So that is something that can potentially impact you and that you need to be aware of when it comes to government policy and political relationships around the world. So for number 5, it is going to be the recognition of degree programs. Now, this is a little bit, I don't want to say more obscure, but it's just in terms of the government policy, like how those are figured out, because you have to keep in mind that even though each school is sort of its own sovereign body in a way, like, you know, Yale is different from UT Austin, is different from University of Westminster, shout out University of Westminster, is different from Oxford. They're all different, but that government policy does play a role in terms of the recognition of degree programs. And this is not so much giving out the degree per se, but also to how another country may recognize that. So if you are in a country that's compatible in a Western country, they're likely going to recognize, let's say you have a law degree, but you have a JD, but then maybe someone has an LLM. Those are not necessarily interchangeable, but they do sort of mean the same thing. Whereas if you're coming from a country of maybe where it's more of an obscure degree from an obscure school, it may not be recognized in the country that you're going to. And so sort of that like stamp of approval and that sort of, definite that this is what this means, no matter what country you're going to. That is what government policies are set to do. Some governments are good about that rather than others, but it's just important to understand that that's kind of how that works when it comes to sort of thinking about the fact of, you can go through and do all you need to do, and then your degree may not be recognized based on different government policies depending on where you're going. And then for number 6, the sixth policy that can impact you is what happens after you study. So this is something that is very important to students because a lot of times when you're thinking about studying abroad, especially if you want to get a degree abroad, you would like to put that degree to practice where you are. And there have been so many of us have been very fortunate to do that, to get to stay on after we studied, to actually work and thrive in the culture that we studied in. But for a lot of students, depending on, again, what the visa policy is, what the economic policy is, you may not be able to stay and do that. And again, in the video that I was talking about the emerging countries, one of the important parts of that was that so many of the countries like Japan, like Ireland, Republic of Ireland, like other countries that have gone through, and they've made it a lot easier for students to be able to not only stay on, but also to be able to have opportunity and access to be able to work part-time jobs while they're waiting to find a job that's more full-time, being able to sort of thrive and move through without feeling the stress that they would in the big 4 countries, let's say, where you have to immediately get a job. And if you don't have a job, like, what are you going to do? And your visa might be cut off and you're freaking out over different things. So that is going to be something that can directly be impacted by government policy. And it's something that you definitely want to just kind of understand, again, like, what is the road for you after you study? Because this is something that I work with students on all the time. They're like, well, what should I try and figure out what I want to do after I study? And is that option available to me? It really depends on whatever the policy is going to be wherever you're going. And so that is something that you need to consider of how governments can impact what you do next. And worst case scenario is that you have to go home. That's, kind of the worst case scenario. For a lot of people, they miss out on the opportunity to be able to work where they just studied. And so you want to be aware of that particular policy. And so did any of these particular ideas on policy surprise you? Have you been impacted by any of these? Do you know anyone impacted by these, whether it's student visas or the economics or the safety, any of that? Leave a comment below. I would love to hear about it. Again, go ahead and check out the video on emerging countries so that you can learn more outside of the big 4. And I will see you on the next one.